So in those three sections, there is a clear reference as to who has the responsibility for regulating chainsaws, whether it is for sales of, ownership, use of, okay, and even the governments, that may use it. They are subject to the regulation, and of course, the sections that we've just went over talks about who has the mandate to do those regulating. Okay, and we've seen that it refers to the department in proper noun, and of course, the department, as defined by the Chainsaw Act, is the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DNR. Okay, so now we're going to look to the DNR and to see if there is within that department a specific bureau that is taking lead into this. And precisely there is one. Okay, and we discussed this in the last lesson. Okay, we're talking about the Forest Management Bureau. They're basically considering their mandate. They are the lead bureau under the DNR as it pertains to forest lands, and naturally the chainsaws are used as a means to destroy that. So the law's purpose of regulating falls in the hands of the Forest Management Bureau. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Forest Management Bureau. Okay, you might recall from lesson 1, okay, that there is a excuse me, there is a slide that we discuss that talks about the specific response, and we said there's a lot of responsibilities that the Bureau of Forest Development has, but specific to the objectives of this course, we enumerated 4. So if you recall that slide, okay, we identified the 4. The first being, first focus on the protection, development, management, regeneration, and reforestation of forest lands. And the others, the second one referring to licensing, the regulation and supervision of the licensing, as well as the conduct of licensees and permittees as it relates to their obligations under those permits or licenses. And that the Bureau is in charge or responsible for the enforcement of essentially laws, rules, and regulations that pertain to forestry, reforestation, parks, games, and other related laws like the wildlife law. Okay, and lastly, that is tasked to regulate, or it has a responsibility to regulate the establishment and operations of those entities that process forest products, sawmills, other mills and wood processing plants, etc. Okay, so again, that's based on what we talked about in lesson 1. Okay, you might also note that the Bureau of Forest Development, as we've discussed in lesson 1, has since been absorbed into the Forest Management Bureau. Okay. So, in terms of, we'll now go back to this law, the Chainsaw Act, and look at the provisions within it that talks about, the authority of the Secretary, because there we'll find a relevant discussion. Okay, Section 9 of RA 9175, the Chainsaw Act, okay, talks about the authority of the Secretary, and the Secretary being the Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources, DNR, the Secretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or SENR, the Secretary. Okay, SENR. Okay, so it talks about the authority of the SENR. Okay, and let's just read it. It says, to effectively implement the provision of this act, the Secretary shall issue the implementing rules and regulations within 90 days, which presumably that was already done because this is dating back to 2002. Okay, and that he shall likewise organize an office within the department to ensure that the requirements imposed by this act may be complied with by qualified persons within the shortest possible time at the least possible expense. So basically, that's what we were looking earlier, and everything that this law, this Chainsaw Act law, has said so far, at least as it relates to Section 4, 5, and 6, when it's making reference to the lead agency within government, it just talks about the department in proper noun. Okay, and so it's not necessarily referring to the bureau under the department. So this provision in the Chainsaw Act kind of connects the dots. Okay, since the secretary, the SENR, the secretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, is the head of office for the department, the Chainsaw Act gave it the power to organize an office within his department to be the lead bureau. Okay, and naturally, since there is already an existing bureau, the Forest Management Bureau, it only made sense that rather than starting brand new, okay, starting to organize brand new, he would essentially just employ what he already has established, which is the Forest Management Bureau. Okay, so at least even if in the very beginning there seems to be a disconnect as to whether the bureau, as we earlier discussed in PD 705, whether they continue to have authority over forest lands, and of course in this case this chainsaw law, since it's very relevant to forest lands. So this provision of the Chainsaw Act kind of clears that up. Okay, it connects the dots, like I said. Okay, so again, we know that the lead agency is the lead bureau under the DNR is the Forest Management Bureau, or FMB. Okay, now take note that the FMB, or DNR for that matter, is not the only. It's odd because we said earlier that everything was absorbed within DNR, but in any case, there is one entity that continues to be independent, who is an independent entity outside of the DNR that has jurisdiction still over some forestry-related laws. Okay, and it pertains to essentially anything within the province of Palawan. That's the second paragraph here. Okay, it says that in the province of Palawan, the provisions of this act, the Chainsaw Act, okay, shall be implemented by the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development. Okay, and the reason why this is being presented as such in this law is that there is already an existing law, an earlier law, okay, RA 7611, or the Strategic Environmental Plan, which specifically created this council, this Palawan Council, giving it authority and jurisdiction over the province of Palawan. So the Chainsaw Act merely just complied to it. It didn't amend that provision, kasi that that law itself kind of focuses specifically on that council, and so if this law was to override it, that would create a kind of a chaos because anyway, what the law decided, what the lawmakers decided in promulgating this law was not to step all over that earlier law, but rather to acknowledge it, to continue to honor it. And that's why they even made this special provision in the second paragraph of Section 9 that specifically reiterates the authority and jurisdiction given to that Palawan Council in that earlier law. So that is the exception. The exception to, that everything should go through the DNR under the Bureau. The exception is the in the province of Palawan under this old law. All right, so we're done with the organization that has the discussion on the organization that has the mandate to essentially do to meet the objectives of the Chainsaw Act, okay, which is to regulate the use, ownership, sales, etc. of chainsaws. Okay, so since we're done with that section, we now move on to the last section and probably the most relevant section to the objective of this course. And of course, this section is that on sanctions, and what this section aims to answer is what are the acts that are punishable under this law. Okay, so let's start. Okay, under the Chainsaw Act, or RA 9175, specifically Section 7, that's where we'll find the penal provisions. Okay, and in that section there are, I think, 4, if I'm not mistaken. Let's take a look. Yes, there are 4 specific acts that are defined to be in violation of this law. There are criminal acts actually with penal sanctions, and that's the reason why their section is called the penal provisions. Okay, so the first one refers to the selling, purchasing, reselling, transferring, distributing, or possessing a chainsaw without a proper permit. Okay, excuse me. The second one refers to unlawful importation or manufacturing of chainsaw. The third, tampering of engine serial number. And the fourth, actual unlawful use of chainsaw. Okay, so many of these unlawful acts were already implied in some of the sections that we discussed moments ago, section 4, 5, and 6, where we talked about authority to manufacture, to import and sell, as well as even possession. So these provisions, these penal provisions, kind of relate back to those provisions. Okay, so let's do the same exercise we did on lesson 1A, okay? Because the real need here, or the real objective here in meeting your goals by taking this course, the goal of essentially and possibly eventually becoming a environmental law enforcement agent, is that you want to develop the skills to be able to be effective in being an environmental law enforcement agent. Okay, so a lot of the work, not everything, not all the work, but there's clearly some work, a lot of the work that involve investigation, and that's also clearly why the title of this program focuses not just on, as you read on the title, the focus of the program focuses not just on the law, but the investigation involving environmental crimes, okay, or violations of the environmental laws. All right, so now let's take a look at these 4 acts under this section that covers penal provisions, and let's do that exercise that we did earlier in analyzing to determine what the elements are, so that we could best conclude if a person, based on evidence that we've gathered, is in violation and is therefore subject to the penal sanctions. Okay, so let's take a look at the first one. I think there's only 4, so I think we'll be able to do all 4 of them. Okay, so the first one, this is the title, but the specific provisions that define and provide for the penalties for this act are as follows. Okay, any person who sells, purchases, transfers the ownership, distributes, or otherwise disposes or possesses a chainsaw without first securing the necessary permit from the department shall be punished with and the penalties. Okay, so again, if we look at or we refer back to what we did last time, there are 3 questions that we would like to answer, and those 3 questions with their answers would essentially allow us to understand what the elements of the offense are. Okay, and the 3 questions are: who did it, who is the perpetrator, who is the offender, and what exactly did he do? And if that act that he did is not by itself a crime, then what made it so it's a crime? So that's the third question. Okay, that's the third question. What is the qualifier? Okay, so let's see if we could answer those three questions based on the specific definition or specific provision defining the crime and penalizing for it. Okay, and we'll also, I think at this point, actually before we do that, let's go ahead and again do the same thing that we did last time. Let's identify who did it, and by reading the provision we could already see that it starts off with the answer to that first question. It says any person, and then it goes on to define exactly what the acts are that make it a crime, okay, or at least what the acts are that lead into possibly making it a crime. And the acts here really are selling, purchasing, transferring the ownership, distributing, or otherwise disposing or possessing a chainsaw. Okay, so that's the act, but it goes further to qualify to ensure that it is concluded as a crime, and the qualification is that those acts were done without first securing the necessary permits from the department. And we already know that the department in proper noun here, is the DNR, and we also know that the DNR through the secretary has assigned the responsibility to the bureau. Okay, so anyway, there you have it. So let's see if we can go ahead and put that on the worksheet that we used last time. All right, so let's look at the second one. We're done with the first one. Let's now analyze the second provision or the second act that's considered criminal act. Okay, and this one is on unlawful importation or manufacturing of chainsaw. Okay, the exact verbiage or language of the law that defines this to be a crime and provides for its penalty goes something like this. It says that any person who imports or manufactures a chainsaw without obtaining prior authorization from the department shall be punished by imprisonment, etc., etc. So ito medyo mas madali ito. Okay? There's only so many words and it looks like it's only one sentence, but even more so, it flows kasi in the very beginning, we're already able to see answers to the three questions. Okay, as to number one, sino ba yung dapat i-consider as the offender? Ano ba yung ginawa niya? And kung hindi pa considered criminal yung ginawa niyang yun, what makes it a crime? Ano yung qualifier? Okay? And we could read all of those already. We could see all of those already just before we even finish a sentence. I think halfway in the sentence, we already have the answer. Okay? So let's take a look. Okay, I'm not going to bother doing the circling and underlining. Medyo obvious na yan. So I'm just going to pull up my worksheet. Okay? And we could already see it. You know, the sentence says any person who does all of these things. So we already know that the offender is any person. So in terms of what these things are that he did, they are, you know, importing, manufacturing a chainsaw. Okay? Any person who imports or manufactures a chainsaw. Okay? So yun lang. It's very simple. It's short and sweet. So any person, that's the offender, and his act is he imports or manufactures a chainsaw. That's simple, okay? But the qualifier is that it is that act was done without obtaining prior authorization from the department, okay? Very important also, like the first one that we did, where it says they must first obtain, okay? This one is similar kasi there is in that sentence, in that qualifier, in that sentence that says without obtaining prior authorization from the department, you know, if you're to really analyze that sentence, it's really talking about obtaining a permit, but it has to be obtained prior. The authorization, authorization through that permit must have been done prior to the actual importation or manufacture of a chainsaw, which again implies that if a person imports or manufactures without a permit, okay, and thinks that he could just cure that problem by attempting to apply or obtain a permit after he's done the act, okay, he may be in for a shock because ito yung language ng law, okay. So again, I should have been a little bit more prepared by checking to see if there's any actual jurisprudence that challenges these things. But just from reading it, understanding it, it's pretty evident that the way they wrote it, it is intended so that anyone who fails to acquire the necessary permits, okay, and does the act, okay, that person doesn't have the remedy of curing that crime or his mistake by trying to apply for a permit after he's done the fact. Okay, so I mean that's how the language reads. Okay, so again, that's something that you're also going to want to be conscious about when you're doing your analysis of whether an offense has been committed or not. Okay, according to the provisions of a particular criminal sanction. Okay, so something that you're going to want to medyo mahasa kumbaga, especially as you develop to your skills and your knowledge towards becoming an environmental law enforcement officer. Okay, so let's move on to the next law. This is the second, not law, but second provision of the second penal provision. So now let's go to the third one. And in this third one, it's talking about tampering of engine serial number. Okay, and the actual language of the law that essentially defines this as a crime and provides for its penalty is also relatively easy. Parang yung the one that we just covered, the second one. This one also easily provides the answers to these three questions upon reading it. Kasi it flows in the same sequence. It first talks about who is the offender, what that offender did, and if what he did is not completely a crime quite conclusively enough, then what made it so it is a crime. Okay, so again, it flows. Let's read it. It says, any person who is found to have defaced or tampered with the original registered engine serial number of any chainsaw until unit, registered engine serial number of any chainsaw unit shall be punished by imprisonment. So I'm not going to read the penalty, but what I just read to you basically provides already the elements. First element being the offender. We already know that it's any person because the sentence starts with that. And the act or omission is that of that person who is found to have defaced or tampered with the original registered engine serial number of any chainsaw unit. Okay, there is no qualifier because that act by itself, with no needed qualification, is already a crime. Okay, so that's the third penal provision. Let's now talk about the fourth, actual unlawful use of chainsaw. The law says any person who is found to be in possession of a chainsaw and uses the same to cut trees and timber in forest land or elsewhere except as authorized by the department shall be penalized, blah, 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 blah. So this also flows, but there's a slight difference in the qualifier. There is a qualifier, I'm sure you already sensed it, pero it's done a little differently. Okay, so it flows according to these questions. So let's now put it on our worksheet. Okay, the first element is the offender. We know again by the fact that it starts with the offender. Okay, and that's any person. And the act or omission is that person being found to be in possession of a chainsaw and uses the same to cut trees and timber in forest land or elsewhere. Okay, and there's a qualifier. Okay, except as authorized by the department. In other words, the act that he did is not per se unlawful. Okay, it's not unlawful. But it's almost the way they phrased it is in general rule. The general rule is it is unlawful except if it's allowed. Parang ganyan. Okay, so it's unlawful to be in possession of a chainsaw. It's unlawful to use it to cut trees and timber in forest land or elsewhere, elsewhere, except if you are given the authority by the department. Okay? So there you have it. Okay, there's some additional provisions that are worthwhile discussing here. There are also paragraphs under the penal provisions under Section 7. Okay, and kasi so far the four enumerated offenses identify any person as the offender. Okay, so these things that I'm about to talk about, these additional penal sanctions, they refer to other types of persons against particular offenders, not just any offender, but these types. Okay, so there's two paragraphs. The first one reads: if the violation under this section is committed by or through the command or order of another person, partnership, or corporation, the penalties herein provided shall likewise be imposed. So basically, it just identifies the officer. This is consistent with the revised forestry code. When we were talking about the actual cutting, etc., etc., etc. And that being, that actual cutting being done by any person, that circumstance is a crime. When it's the cutting is done without permits. Okay, and that we also said in that same provision, third circumstance where it identifies the officer in the case of a partnership, in a corporation, etc., etc. That person would be liable when he orders. Okay. So it's similar. This is similar to that. Okay, so it's talking about almost identical, really. It's talking about when a person, basically that person being someone from a partnership or corporation who commands or orders another, okay, to commit any of those four earlier provisions that we talked about, those four offenses, then it makes it so that person who did the commanding and the ordering is also liable. Okay. So now the interesting thing about this is it doesn't specify that that person has to be an officer. It just says, that another person commanded or ordered. Okay. And that it's the another person, but it also makes partnerships or corporations equally liable when the command or order is from them. Okay, so the another person and partnerships or corporations are two separate entities that are equally liable. Okay, and when it's referring to partnership or corporations, it doesn't even qualify that the person within that has to be an officer of. So medyo, although it's almost identical to the one discussing the revised forestry code, it's broader. Okay, it's not as specific. Okay, so that's that. The last paragraph here also talks about liabilities of public officials or employees of the government. Okay. So it reads that if the offender is a public officer, a public official, or employee, in addition to the penalties based on which of the four offenses he or she committed, he shall also be removed from office, perpetually disqualified from holding any public office. So that's an additional sanction against public officials or employees. So here's something which I think is worthwhile mentioning, a noteworthy mention. This actually is something that was also in the Forestry Act, but I did not include it. But I thought to include it this time around. Okay, it's not a sanction, but it's something that is worthwhile mentioning. Okay, in Section 8 of the Chainsaw Act, or RA 9175, there is a provision for a reward. And it basically allows or entitles any person who voluntarily gives information leading to the recovery or confiscation of an unregistered chainsaw and the eventual conviction of the person charged thereof okay, this person would be entitled to a reward equivalent to 20% of the value of the chainsaw. Okay, so again, this is any person. Okay, any person, is eligible to get this reward, 20% reward of the value of the chainsaw. Okay, but don't think that if, say, for example, it interests you, don't think that by just reporting your neighbor who you're pissed off at uh, is going to allow you to get this reward. Okay, remember that if a person is a legitimate suspect, okay, you must first be convicted. Okay, so it may be a while before you can get this, but nonetheless, this is an interesting provision to mention. Since all of you guys are looking to pursue a possible career in law enforcement, namely in environmental law enforcement, that kind of work is not limited to actual members of the PNP, NBI, or the government for that matter. There are private entities, and interestingly enough, this reward system even really talks of, or basically gives this an opportunity for someone to actually make make some money, even if they're not affiliated with any government agencies. Okay, so it's just again a noteworthy mention. It's not something that you could really benefit from immediately, but it's a worthwhile mention. Okay, so that ends basically lesson 1B, the Chainsaw Act. We again were able to discuss the rationale behind the Chainsaw Act. We were able to discuss the organizations that are tasked or charged with ensuring the delivery of the objectives of that law, that of being able to regulate the use, possession, and ownership, etc., of chainsaws. And in addition to that, we were able to focus in and even look at each of the sanctions, each of the criminal offenses, or offenses that are criminalized by this law. There's 4 of them. Okay, so having completed all of that, we're pretty much done with lesson 1B, and of course the entire lesson 1. So here at this point, I will end here and see you or talk to you again on the next lessons.